The 2023 Defence Strategic Review, along with the Surface Fleet Review the following year, made many fundamental changes to the ADF's outlook, not least in the naval domain. With the proposal to bring the fleet's strength up to 20 manned major surface combatants at its core, these documents laid out a plan to turn the ailing Australian Navy into a modern, globally significant fighting force, comparable in most ways, short of nukes and aircraft carriers, with navies like those of the French or the British. But despite the positive outlook for the Navy as a whole, the review was not all sunshine and roses, and for one program in particular, the authors were scathing. To quote the report, "The OPV is an inefficient use of resources for civil maritime security operations and does not possess the survivability and self-defense systems to contribute to a surface combatant mission." The OPV that the report is discussing is, of course, the RAN's Arafura class, a 1,600-ton patrol boat which, when it was conceived in 2009 as the Offshore Combatant Vessel, or OCV, was supposed to be something of a naval panacea. A vessel which could, with the help of modular systems, consolidate Australia's mishmash of patrol, mine countermeasure, hydrographic and oceanographic ships into a single hull type, simplifying support and maximising efficiency. Moreover, the original conception would have seen these ships able to pinch hit in restricted combat scenarios, with the ability to, quote, undertake offshore and littoral warfighting roles, border protection tasks, long-range counter-terrorism and counter-piracy operations, support special forces, and missions in support of security and stability in the immediate neighbourhood. But, alas, it wasn't to be. Years of cuts, changing requirements, and, frankly, strategic incoherence across the program as a whole saw the fleet of 20 OCVs morph into 12 and now just 6 more or less single-purpose OPVs. With the modular hydrographic and mine countermeasure systems cut, along with the large UAVs which were supposed to be deployed with the vessels, they are today essentially giant patrol boats with the same 25mm gun as on the Armidale that they were supposed to be replacing. Their new role, again according to the Fleet Review, will be, quote, focused on civil maritime security operations and enhanced regional engagement in the Southwest Pacific and maritime Southeast Asia. These vessels will also provide the additional capability and capacity for civil marine security operations surge requirements in lieu of Tier 1 and Tier 2 surface combatants. That is to say, they are essentially going to be doing the job of the current evolved Cape-class fleet, while also potentially popping around to Pacific Island nations and undertaking presence and naval diplomacy. Now, I don't want to disparage what is good and useful work, but we need to consider the opportunity cost inherent in that decision. For all the good work that the DSR and Surface Fleet Review did for the Navy in the long term, the harsh truth is that the only hulls hitting the water between now and 2029 at best will be Army littoral manoeuvre vessels and Arafura OPVs, while at the same time, our Anzac frigate fleet will continue to shrink as age takes its toll. If we are to see Australia's real naval strength grow at all between now and the end of the decade, the period of time where we keep being told we are at our most strategically vulnerable, then doing something with the Arafura is essentially our only real option. Fortunately, the government also seemed to have at least recognised this issue, if not committed to actually doing anything about it. The Fleet Review's recommendation regarding the Arafura, which the government accepted, read as follows, quote, whilst the OPV cannot conduct other roles, such as mine countermeasure or military survey, in its as designed and delivered state, further investigation should be undertaken to determine how the OPVs could contribute to other mission sets. If this proves feasible, they should be replaced by evolved Cape-class patrol boats in the civil maritime security operations function. It is this slim thread of hope that we have to cling to if we want to see something useful done with the class, and Essentially, that's what this video will explore. We'll look at 3 potential options for the Arafura fleet, what it would take to get the individual ships equipped to fill each of the 3 roles, and what benefits that the specific role would bring to Australia and to the ADF. We'll also consider why the government might, or might not, choose to use the Arafuras in these particular ways. So, without any more throat clearing, let's move on to option 1, the current assumed base case of using them as a fleet of patrol boats. The current plan, as far as public statements suggest, is that the Arafuras will essentially be the heavy units of the RAN's existing patrol boat group, being large and robust enough that they can operate further afield than the current evolved capes can comfortably do, and using that ability to undertake naval diplomacy and presence missions in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. As far as the why goes, being why the government might choose to go this way with the OPV fleet, well, in some ways, most ways really, it's the path of least resistance. The Arafura will need essentially no modifications and incur no further costs to fill this role, and it was, if you don't read too much between the lines, what the Independent Fleet Review recommended. While this is probably my least preferred option out of the 3, to be clear, it's not as though there's no logic behind the concept or that the idea is completely crazy. The Arafuras are large, steel-hulled, rugged vessels, which means that, at least in theory, they can go places that the evolved capes just can't, most particularly into the rough waters of the Southern Ocean, and just generally undertake longer patrols farther from shore without putting the vessels at risk if the sea state gets up too high. Given how large Australia's EEZ and general area of interest is, there's value in assets which can do this without tying up a major surface combatant or putting harsh sea hours onto aging Anzac hulls. Growing the patrol boat fleet, especially with bigger and more capable vessels like the Arafuras, will also free up, at least on some occasions, the even larger and costlier ships to run from the more menial naval duties. For example, a few weeks ago, HMAS Chulz was sent to rescue a Lithuanian rower attempting to cross the Tasman from Cyclone Alfred. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Chulz shouldn't have gone. Maritime rescue is a pretty fundamental duty to all mariners, civilian and military alike, and Chulz's presence almost certainly saved this man's life. But there is a certain undeniable inefficiency to sending a 16,000-ton amphib with a crew of 158 to rescue one man in a rowboat. Having more hulls around won't eliminate that role for the big ships. Sometimes it's just going to work out that they're the nearest vessel and so they'll be sent. But it could reduce the number of times they'll need to be specifically tasked to do this kind of work, which could probably be done just as well by something smaller and cheaper to run, like an Arafura. A similar case can be made for the Pacific Presence and Engagement mission, which, no doubt, Australia really does need to do. In the post-Trump world, soft power is of more significance than ever, with USAID gutted and America essentially stepping away from its role at the center of Western international development aid. The task of maintaining good relationships with Pacific states will fall even more fully than it had before on the shoulders of Australia and New Zealand. The alternative is to risk allowing China to grow its presence in the region and potentially one day to establish a permanent militarized presence within our immediate region, a level of strategic threat that Australia hasn't felt anything close to since the darkest days of confrontasi with Indonesia or the tensions around the East Timor campaign. Just like in the search and rescue role, there will be a place in that mission set for the bigger vessels, particularly during disaster relief and similar humanitarian missions. But when they're just showing the flag, the Arafuras will be more than capable. Finally, if they are ultimately utilised in this manner, the Arafuras could serve as the core of a true Australian Coast Guard, which could gradually absorb the on-water roles currently undertaken by Border Force and the Navy Patrol Boat Group. Calls to establish an Australian Coast Guard have waxed and waned over the years, and Personally, while I feel like it's something of a solution in search of a problem, duplicating elements of the other services without necessarily growing the recruitment pool or solving any other problems, there are other, much more informed people than me who certainly think it's a good idea, so it could be a possibility. Regardless of whether they're integrated into Navy or Coast Guard, more low-level ships clearly can be put to use. But there are two major issues with this concept of operations. The first is that while all of this is undeniably useful and important work, the Arafura as the platform to do it feels like the product of a different and far less dangerous time. The Fleet Review called the OPV an inefficient use of resources, and if they're deployed as patrol boats, I think that we'll very quickly see these ships eating up scarce crews, money, and maintenance time disproportionate to the level of capability that they provide to the ADF. And if the dire forecasts about the strategic situation coming into the second half of this decade are right, then we can no longer afford that level of inefficiency. The second point to make, though, is that almost nothing in the currently assumed low-intensity mission set would be lost or ruled out by upgrading these OPVs into something more useful. Once we decide to commit the cash, then all we really need are a few extra people and a little deadweight capacity. Better equipped versions of these ships would still do the Pacific Presence mission and still assist the patrol boat force if that was the best use of them during peacetime. They'd just also be available to undertake different and more useful roles during conflict. The second broad option, and probably the second most likely role for the Arafura to ultimately be given within the fleet, is to retask them as auxiliary ships, undertaking combat-adjacent roles. Mine countermeasure and hydrographic survey were directly called out as possible options in the fleet review, and they make the most immediate sense. In a very simplistic analysis, Australia is currently in the process of retiring 4 Huon-class mine hunters and 2 Lewin-class hydrographic survey ships, while at the same time bringing into service 6 Arafura-class OPVs. The maths is pretty straightforward and hard to argue with. Do a one-for-one swap and we lose no capability. And in practice, it probably wouldn't be that much more challenging than it appears on paper, on the survey side in particular. While a lot of the equipment currently on board the Lewins might be due for an upgrade, some of the kit, like the Funtoon-class survey motorboats for example, or the Remus 100S UUVs, which were only delivered in 2020, could be ported over directly. And the kinds of echo sounders and sonars which are equipped on these vessels are hardly cutting-edge defense technology. Civilian equipment could almost certainly be acquired and fitted as aftermarket add-ons for the Arafuras with relative ease by any number of smaller marine yards around the country. Mine countermeasure is admittedly a bit more challenging, but not as much as you might think. Through C-1778, Navy acquired a small but modern modular mine countermeasure capability in the form of a small number of Bluefin 9 and 12 UUVs and a handful of manned and autonomous small boats and other equipment to support their operations. Additional examples of all of these could be purchased to bulk up mine countermeasure capabilities and take advantage of the larger Arafuras relative to the Huons. The government also got fairly far down the road towards selecting and acquiring additional mine countermeasure kit through C-1905, which had shortlisted the companies Saab and Exail as the final 2 contenders to provide a more comprehensive suite of unmanned systems. Originally, these were to be deployed on vessels of opportunity, but eventually they were supposed to go on dedicated mine countermeasure vessels as part of later phases. Though this program was ultimately cancelled, it could be reactivated, or a similar system could be sole sourced, either wholesale from overseas or from an Australian manufacturer. Assuming sufficient resources were dedicated to the project, this would address a real weakness in Australia's mine warfare capabilities as our Huons continue to drop away without a replacement. So, if it's so straightforward, why wasn't this path simply mandated in the government's response to the fleet review? Well, I have a couple of theories. Firstly, we don't actually know for sure that this isn't happening behind the scenes. The government did agree, after all, to the recommendation that alternative roles for the Arafuras should be investigated. And these two were the only alternative roles specifically called out in the paper. It's possible that some staffer at Russell offices is beavering away on this very proposal right now. But with no mention of it in any of the reviews or documents released since, and no money allocated in the government's recent budget, if it is happening, it's probably not happening soon. Second, it's possible that Navy doesn't actually want to run dedicated mine countermeasure or survey ships. Hydrographic technology, both on ships and airborne, has been improving and is now broadly available commercially. In fact, the government has stated that it intends to contract out all hydrographic surveys going forward, though they haven't fully explained how this will work for dangerous or sensitive missions, such as directly supporting submarine operations. On mine countermeasure vessels, many of the recent purchases suggest that the government wants to move away from dedicated mine countermeasure vessels and towards a more distributed model, with modular and autonomous equipment that can be deployed from any ship of convenience. This movement away from dedicated mine warfare vessels is probably only going to be emphasized if the evolved Megami is selected to fill C-3000 at the end of this year. The dedicated mine hunting sonar on board the ship will see more than half of our major service combatants equipped with quite potent mine countermeasure systems. While personally I still see value in dedicated MCM vessels, there's certainly a case to be made that at that point there are better places to allocate resources, especially skilled crews. That said, there are other potential roles for the vessels which could be considered, which would give asymmetric value despite their small size. One option would be to equip the ships not as mine sweepers, but as mine layers. Sea mines have long been proven a highly effective deterrent in certain specific conditions, and as the war in the Black Sea has shown, they retain significant value today. In a defensive war, Australia could selectively mine certain key approaches to maximise risk to opponents attempting to get close. Clearly, the RAN sees this value and has been getting back into the mine-laying game of late. In 2023, the government confirmed the decision to purchase an unspecified number of smart mines from RWM Italia, a Rheinmetall subsidiary, and the following year it laid its first mine in nearly half a century as part of Exercise Dugong 24. While modern mines can generally be laid by numerous means, including by air and submarine, this hasn't eliminated the need for mine layers across the board. The South Koreans retain dedicated mine-laying vessels, as do several European navies. While converting all 6 Arafuras to full-time mine layers might be a bit much, acquiring the equipment to rapidly convert them on a modular basis would be a cheap and quick way to boost flexibility in mine warfare. Another potential option would be to convert the Arafuras into drone tender vessels. They have much of the equipment needed to allow the ship to deploy large numbers of unmanned surface and subsurface drones, a capability which Australia is seeking to become something of a leader in. The Speartooth, for example, is a domestic UUV from C2 Robotics, which has been prototyped in lengths of 8 and 11 meters. These could be deployed and controlled from a suitably modified Arafura in decent numbers, relying on the surface ship to get them more or less into position before continuing to complete their mission, whatever that might be, more discreetly under the water, without putting people directly into harm's way. This could even dovetail nicely with a previous mission, as mine deployment would likely be a suitable mission concept for a large UUV, such as Speartooth, to undertake. One key point to note about all 4 of these options, drone tender, mine countermeasure vessel, mine layer, or hydrographic survey ship alike, is that to one extent or another, they all rely on modular and unmanned systems, which could probably be moved around fairly freely, potentially allowing the Arafura to serve in any or all of these roles in a temporary basis at relatively low cost, once the necessary baseline structural modifications were made, assuming any were even needed. With a few modular systems tossed on board and the correct unmanned drone launching out the stern, An Arafura could go from a hydrographic survey ship one day to map out the route, to mine-laying drone tender the next, to minesweeper a few weeks later if and when the threat passes, with little more than a brief harbour visit in between to swap out systems, change over drones, and pick up a few skilled personnel to operate the new systems. This capability could be had very quickly and probably for a very low cost, and has the benefit of allowing cash to be splashed amongst various Australian domestic companies, many of which can offer quite advanced capabilities in several of these spaces. If the RAN isn't at least considering this option, they're missing a trick. But that's not the only option, as I'm sure everyone watching has figured out. So now we need to talk about armaments. Much like option 2, there's an appealingly simple logic behind the arguments to upgun the Arafuras. Australia lacks a sufficient number of armed vessels in its surface fleet, while at the same time we're building 6 decently large but very lightly armed OPVs. The solution seems to be staring us in the face. Arm the OPVs, and the problem is solved. However, while the logic is delightfully straightforward, the reality is likely to be anything but. The truth is, as much as we might wish it, there's not really a practical way to turn these OPVs into corvettes, true full-spectrum combatants which can do anti-air, anti-submarine, and anti-surface warfare, at least not at this stage of the build. Lack of a helicopter hangar and associated equipment is a massive detriment here, and ultimately too many decisions have already been made in building the things, which would make going back and converting them to corvettes essentially a full rebuild, at which point just buy a new ship. So we need to lower our eyes a bit and consider precisely what we need these vessels to do, and then from there decide how best to arm them. Anyone who's sat through my modern Bathurst video will know what I think the RAN needs in 2025. A cheap, domestic-built ASW-capable escort that can keep the sea lanes of communication open in the Indian and Southern Pacific Oceans in the event that we're ever blockaded by nuclear submarines operating out of China. Unfortunately, the Arafura, lacking the ability to operate an ASW helicopter, is never going to be able to fit that bill. While technically they do have a helipad, they lack the structural reinforcement, refueling system, and hangar that would be required to turn them into a long-range helicopter-capable asset. And without a helicopter, no matter what kit we put on them, asking them to serve in an ASW role would be asking the men and women serving aboard them to fight with one hand tied behind their back. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Arafura is fated to be forever entirely useless as an ASW asset. In the vein of the modular systems discussed earlier, the addition of a containerized towed array sonar could potentially allow 1 or 2 Arafuras to serve as adjuncts to an Anzac frigate, with the OPVs providing targeting data via their sonars, operating alone or in biostatic mode, and the Anzac, which lacks a towed array, providing the MH-60 Romeo Seahawk ASW helicopter, which would actually prosecute that target. So there is a role for the Arafura in subsurface warfare when operating as part of a team, but individually as a standalone ASW asset, I think it's always going to be lacking. The Arafura has slightly more potential in the air warfare domain, but only slightly. The ship's sensors are currently quite limited, but they could potentially be upgraded, assuming money was made available. A logical first step would be the addition of a more capable lightweight radar option to supplement or replace the existing general-purpose scan-to radar. Potential options might be the CEA Technologies SeaTac ASA radar, or one of Saab's Sea Giraffe series of radars. This new radar could potentially be supplemented by adding a more capable electro-optical system, or by going all the way to a proper infrared search and track to further enhance situational awareness. The Vampire next generation system from Sargam would be an excellent choice, given that it's already been integrated on the Anzacs and therefore on Saab's 9LV combat system, which the Arafuras share. Unfortunately though, the sensors are in some ways the easy part. Actually arming the Arafura for air warfare is probably going to be quite a bit harder. Mark 41 cells are almost certainly a non-starter, which means we're limited to what can be bolted onto the deck. The main gun, currently the same, not particularly useful 25mm gun that used to equip the Armidale class, could potentially be reverted back to the 57mm Bofors found on the reference Dar es Salaam class design, which would give some limited capability to SWAT incoming drones and subsonic cruise missiles, but the ship already had problems integrating the 40mm gun it was supposed to be delivered with, and there's no guarantee that reverting to the 57mm would necessarily help there. We could also potentially look at integrating some very light defensive missiles, such as the RIM-116 rolling airframe missile or the Israeli Sea Dome system. But these are little more than self-defense weapons, certainly valuable for those on board, but not really adding much to the ship in terms of utility in the area air defense role. So that basically leaves anti-surface operations, and fortunately, this appears to be the area where the Arafura is both most needed and probably most capable, once some upgrades are applied. The first way that the Arafuras could potentially make themselves useful in the anti-surface domain would be to equip them for small boat defense. The threat from small boats to bigger warships goes back centuries, but in the modern context, it was first meaningfully recognized in the 2000s, with a Middle Eastern or Iranian contingency in mind. Swarms of fast, maneuverable, lightly armed or kamikaze attack boats could represent a significant threat to major service combatants in shallow littoral waters, whose weapons weren't optimized to fight these kinds of numerous short-range threats. This danger has only grown as the Ukrainians have pioneered unmanned kamikaze boats, like their famous Sea Baby drones, which have been at the forefront of their effectively successful campaign to drive the Russians from the Black Sea. It was this small boat threat, in part, that the US developed the Littoral Combat Ship to face, and while that program has been something of a disaster, it doesn't make the threat any less significant. Whether tasked with defending forward ports where Australian warships might be sheltering, or simply covering bigger vessels which might need to operate in littoral waters, the Arafura could have a role here. Logical upgrades would be some degree of improvements to the sensor suite along the lines of what we talked about earlier to defend against aerial threats, but these can probably be considered baseline for any upgrades to the Arafura. A level of self-defense capability against these same threats would also be required. This could come in the form of an upgraded main gun, or the gun could be removed entirely to save weight and replaced by various dedicated drone defense weapons, such as EOS's Maritime Counter-UAS, and a soft kill system such as their DEW system, though space and power generation rather than weight would probably become the limiting factor there if you wanted a decent number of them. For offense against small boats, Arafuras would need to be equipped with some kind of low-cost, light anti-surface weapons. Loitering munitions probably make the most sense from a time and cost to deployment metric. One option would be the domestic-built OWL, which the ADF is already adopting, but these are large and not necessarily quick to launch in a naval context. Other options might be the US-built Switchblade family of drones or the Israeli Hero series, both of which are much more compact and both of which have sealed launchers already developed, which could be, and in some cases have been, applied in a naval context. On the Arafura, these launchers could be mounted in the space which, in the reference design, once held anti-ship missiles. That system maturity might be enough to give one of the non-domestic options the edge, though there are obviously enough political issues with both potential suppliers right now. Regardless of the chosen manufacturer, these weapons could be guided onto targets using cheap militarized quad or octocopter drones rather than manned helicopters. Finally, particularly if serving in a harbour defence role, the Arafura could likely also be equipped with mine countermeasure equipment like we spoke about earlier, as a vessel of opportunity. I realize that this feels like a lot of additional capability to put on the vessel, but none of these systems individually should add significant weight to the overall ship, as most are designed to be light and often portable. If the ship were required to do a low-threat mission, a fisheries patrol in the Southern Ocean for example, many of them could simply be removed and replaced with more relevant kit. Mine countermeasure gear could be swapped out for ribs, for example, or most of the owls could be removed to save weight for additional supplies to extend the ship's endurance. On the other hand, the opposite would also be true when operating in a harbour defence capacity. Weight savings could be made simply by reducing the endurance of the vessel. After all, there's no need to equip enough fuel and provisions for the 21-day endurance that the OPV mission required when you're never going to be more than a few kilometres from resupply. The other potential surface warfare niche for the Arafura to fill is at the other end of the spectrum to the small boat threat. If your algorithm put this video into your feed, then it's probably not news to you that in February and March of 2025, the Australian media was sent into a frenzy by the highly unusual action of a Chinese naval task force being deployed to circumnavigate Australia. While nothing they did was illegal under international law, neither was it a friendly visit. The ships, a Type 55 cruiser, Type 54A frigate, and a replenishment ship, made no port calls and undertook live fire exercises in the Tasman Sea, right in the busy transit corridor between Australia's east coast and New Zealand. This operation, which was essentially unprecedented from China, also happened to be timed, probably at least somewhat by coincidence, right along with the geopolitical ructions occurring between the United States and its allies, particularly in Europe, and heightened fears about the US's real level of enthusiasm to continue its global commitments. As a result, the event was somewhat sensationalized by the media at the time, but even through the spin, it was clear that Australia's naval response was not entirely adequate. Typically, a task force of this sort, which is not making port visits and not necessarily welcome, is shadowed when passing close by, even when they remain outside of territorial waters in the legal sense. This isn't just an Australian thing. Almost all nations who have a coastline and the naval capacity to defend it undertake similar operations. Australia reportedly undertook this mission using, at various times, HMAS Arunta, HMAS Stuart, HMAS Warramunga, and HMAS Toowoomba to undertake the escort role, but we were only able to do it with support from the Kiwis, who provided the support ship HMNZS Aotearoa and one of their two Anzac frigates, HMNZS Te Kaha, which was at one point the only ship following the task force. So, while, yes, the Australian and New Zealand navies absolutely were able to maintain their shadowing of the Chinese fleet throughout its circumnavigation, and they should be commended for that, it should also be noted that those 5 Anzac-class vessels represent nearly half of the major surface combatant strength of the two navies combined. And once HMAS Arunta is retired next year, and the Hobart-class destroyers begin their midlife upgrades, it will be over half of the combined available fleet. Given maintenance requirements and other demands on our ships, this single task force deployment likely consumed very nearly every single major surface combatant that Australia and New Zealand had available at the time. Had the Chinese chosen to deploy a second task force, something they're more than capable of doing given the size of the PLAN, then, depending on exactly where they ended up geographically, Australia would likely have struggled to shadow them, potentially being forced to rely on non-frontline combatants like patrol boats or amphibs to escort them, or we may simply not have had vessels available to do the job and been forced to rely solely on aerial surveillance, which is a pretty frightening prospect given the global strategic situation. The Chinese have directly said that Australia had better get used to their ships operating in our part of the world, so we do need to prepare for this sort of thing to happen again, and that is where the Arafuras could potentially come in. Now, to be completely clear and unambiguous here, I'm not saying that an Arafura, even an upgraded Arafura, is ever going to be anything like a true match for a Chinese Type 55 cruiser. Clearly, that's never going to be the case. But let's be honest, in a straight-up fight, nor is an Anzac. The purpose of a shadowing operation is not about being able to win in a fight if the other side suddenly decided to start lobbing missiles at the nearest friendly city. It's about sending an important diplomatic message. We see you, we know what you're doing, and we know you're doing it in a part of the world that, legalities aside, we consider to be our backyard. The relative strengths of the combatants is somewhat irrelevant in that context. The UK, for example, has, in the recent past, undertaken shadowing missions of Russian vessels using ships like minesweepers or river-class OPVs, which are broadly similar vessels to the Arafuras in their current configuration. So it certainly can be done with lightly armed ships. Plausibly, the Arafuras as they exist could be tapped to undertake this escort role in the event of future Chinese operations in our part of the world. However, the UK's operations in the English Channel and the North Sea are geographically quite different compared to those that Australia would be undertaking. Simply because of the relatively small scale of their island, there's nowhere in the UK's home waters where a potential Russian interloper would ever be particularly far away from British air power, nor from additional naval power for that matter, be it on the surface or beneath. If anything were to happen, the threat is implied, but clear. That's not the case in Australia. A Chinese warship in the Great Australian Bight, for example, or off the coast of Western Australia, is operating a very long way away from where the RAAF masses its maritime strike capability in the Northern Territory. If something were to happen, it would be at least hours before an airborne strike package could be repositioned and assembled. Potentially, we might be talking about more than a day if a significant number of assets like tankers also need to be repositioned. And that assumes that a suitable airfield exists within range of the ships as they continue to maneuver. Now, obviously, any such conflict being randomly sparked off by a cruiser passing through the Southern Ocean is unlikely in the extreme, but regardless, the Arafura's shadowing probably do need to present some kind of credible threat, if only for the diplomatic positioning, which is ultimately at the heart of the whole exercise anyway. Luckily, in the modern era, any ship equipped with modern anti-ship cruise missiles represents a threat which can't simply be ignored by another vessel, no matter the size disparity. So the Arafuras can be armed to make them suitable for this role. The reference vessel for the Arafura, the Darussalam class OPV, mounts 4 Exocet cruise missiles in angled box launchers immediately aft of the bridge. Images of new ship Arafura show that this area does not seem to be currently utilised for anything, so it seems plausible that the launchers could be added back in, assuming no structural strengthening was removed from the reference design. That said, actually firing those missiles probably would come at the expense of one or both of the ship's ribs, which are stored next door in the current design. This could potentially be overcome by designing some exhaust deflectors, or simply by accepting that if you ever find yourself in a position where you need to be firing these missiles at short notice, toasting some ribs is probably going to be the least of your worries. Of course, given that the RAN currently doesn't use the Exocet, a more appropriate missile would need to be selected. The logical choice is the Naval Strike Missile, which is replacing the Harpoon in Australian service. Though limited in range and subsonic, the NSM is stealthy and smart, using passive sensors to minimize its detection risk and maximize its chances of penetration. It also has the added benefit that domestic production lines exist for both the missile itself and the box launchers that it will be fired from. Finally, at 400 kilos with its booster, the NSM is practically svelte compared to the 800 kilo behemoth of the Exocet, meaning that, in theory, 8 NSMs could be equipped on board for roughly the same weight as on the reference design. 8 stealthy modern cruise missiles is far from a guaranteed kill on a hostile vessel, especially given their relatively small warheads, but neither is it a threat that any ship, even a Type 55, can entirely dismiss. If even one missile got through and damaged a critical sensor or set off secondary explosions, it could easily mission kill a ship, even without sinking it, and force it to limp back home, no doubt pursued by long-range RAAF assets like the P-8 Poseidon, a position no surface combatant would want to be in. Obviously, in just about any situation where an Arafura found itself firing its missiles, it would expect a return volley, and therefore some degree of capable self-defense system is owed to the crew aboard the OPV. While the main gun, if upgraded, would offer some defensive capability, I think there's a strong case here for removing the main gun entirely and using the space and weight savings to employ the RIM-116 rolling airframe missile. The RIM-116 is a German US designed self-defense missile with a dual-mode RF and IR seeker and blast fragmentation warhead effective out to about 9 kilometers. They're launched from a rotating Mark 144 GML that houses 21 missiles. This conventional model would be the preferred method of employing the RIM-116 aboard the Arafura, but it would require that both the basic radar and IRST or electro-optical sensor upgrades we spoke about previously were installed, and that they could be integrated with a weapon system relatively quickly and easily. If either of those conditions weren't able to be met, then the C-RAM, which combines an 11-cell launcher with the sensors of the Phalanx Sea-Whiz, would be an acceptable standalone alternative, though it comes with additional cost and weight for a smaller magazine, and has the much more serious problem of a pretty major blind spot where the sensors will be blocked by the ship's bridge. So this would very much be a non-preferred option. Finally, if space and weight allow, soft kill systems should also be considered, whether that's some kind of electronic warfare capability or, at the very least, the domestically designed and built Nulka missile decoy system should be installed, given the very low weight penalty that the system imposes and its outsized capability to defend the ship. Again, to reiterate, the objective here is not, under any circumstances, to equip the OPVs to fight Chinese warships operating in Australian waters. It is to equip them as enough of a credible asymmetric threat to those warships that they can credibly serve in the shadowing role, nothing more. While I think the advantages of arming the Arafuras like this are self-evident, there are some issues with this concept of operations as well that need to be addressed. The first is speed. OPVs are built for endurance rather than raw performance and typically top out somewhere around 20 knots. The Arafura is no exception in this area, and it would likely be further slowed down if additional weight were added to meaningfully arm the ship. This could be a problem if the Arafura is tasked with shadowing major surface combatants, which can achieve much higher top speeds. The Type 55, for example, has a publicly acknowledged top speed of 30 knots, and could likely go faster if pushed. But here, as in so many other ways, Australia will benefit from its geography. Given our distance from China or just about any plausible maritime opponent in the next decade or so, any ship that an Arafura is tasked to shadow will very likely be operating in such a way as to maximize fuel efficiency, limiting their practical top speed for anything more than short bursts to something slower and more economical than their theoretical maximum. And if they do decide to try and sprint away, airborne or spaceborne assets could maintain the track and allow the Arafura to catch up when the bigger ship has to slow down or risk running itself dry. On the other hand, if a hostile ship weren't worried about running out of fuel, then that would very likely be because it was traveling in convoy with a supply ship, as was the case with the Chinese flotilla which circumnavigated Australia. In this instance, then the speed of the overall task group is functionally limited to the speed of its slowest vessel, which will almost always be the supply ship. Typically, these things motor along in the mid-teens of knots, allowing the Arafura to keep up. A second major concern that will be raised to upgunning the Arafuras is cost and capability. Bringing them into some kind of usable state will not be cheap. We could assume a baseline sensor suite upgrade, which includes a CTAC radar and IRST, would likely cost a minimum of $25 to $30 million based on previous contracts, but that could easily increase if there were challenges with installation or if the weight of even the smaller CTAC radar up so high affected the vessel's seakeeping. The naval strike missiles alone would cost nearly $10 million per ship, and that's before buying and installing the launchers. And a CRAM launcher with 11 missiles would cost on the order of about $50 million a pop. Admittedly, you might save some money using the standard Mark 144 launcher and tying it in with the ship's sensors, but any savings made would probably be offset by the extra $15 million or so worth of missiles you need to pay to fill a 21 versus an 11-cell launcher, and definitely by the cost to integrate that launcher into the existing sensors and the 9LV combat system on the Arafuras. Add it all up, including some contingency for installation and integration costs, and I reckon you'd be lucky to get change out of around $150 million per ship, maybe $200 million if things go wrong, or if more structural support has been removed from the design than has been made public. And at the end of that process, you're left with a ship that probably lacks the multi-role capability to even be considered a corvette, at a cost which, once you include the initial design and development now just spread over 6 ships instead of 12, will probably exceed $500 million a copy, potentially over $600 million. There would probably be some savings to be had kitting these vessels out in the Minehunter or drone defense configuration we talked about earlier, but ultimately there's not likely to be truly massive savings there, given how much of the money has already been spent. And even in their most capable form, there's a strong argument that undertaking this program would be seen as purely reactionary to the Chinese circumnavigation of Australia. So why spend the money? We could redirect it to C3000 and get more frigates, or maybe bring the 11 we're currently planning forward, bring them into service faster. Well, for me, that comes down to what I said earlier. And I know I keep coming back to this chart, but it keeps being relevant. Our major surface combatant hulls are falling critically low in the second half of this decade, right when we might need them the most. And even this chart is somewhat optimistic in assuming absolutely nothing goes wrong and we get our first general purpose frigate commissioned, in the water and ready to fight by 2029, which is far from guaranteed. If we want meaningful, domestically built armed surface vessels guaranteed in service before the end of the decade, then we have exactly one choice. It's upgunned Arafuras or nothing. Moreover, a lot of that sticker price has already been spent in development and redesign work from the baseline design. In other words, even if we just built the 6 vessels which are currently planned with no changes, we couldn't realistically expect to get away with average prices much lower than about $450 million, and that's probably optimistic. Call it gambler's ruin if you want, but in my mind, if we're spending that much already, the extra $100 to $200 million a pop to turn these things into warships capable of doing something, even if it's just a single thing, and even if that capability becomes less relevant in 5 to 10 years as the rest of the expanded fleet comes online, it's money worth spending. Incidentally, that's also my reasoning behind not supporting the transition over to something like the C-90 Corvette, which Lursen has apparently offered the government. This vessel, which is currently being built for the Bulgarian Navy, is derived from the same baseline as the Arafura, and once upon a time, the current lines building the Arafuras could have been rapidly retooled to build these far more competent multi-domain warfare vessels fairly quickly and cheaply, which would have been an excellent idea in my opinion 2 or 3 years ago. But now, We've cut steel on the first 5 OPVs, 2 are in the water, 1 has been accepted by defence. We're probably past the point where a wholesale retooling is practical, especially with the order curtailed to just 6 ships. There are arguments to be made that perhaps the next 6 ships, which were at one point set to be procured, potentially could have been up-spec'd to true corvettes. But those arguments were, presumably, made to the authors of the Strategic Fleet Review and apparently failed to compel them to recommend such a move to the government. No question, I personally would way rather see the RAN commissioning 6 corvettes over the next few years than 6 undergunned OPVs, or even 3 OPVs and 3 true corvettes. But that's not happening. We're getting 6 OPVs, and we're simply going to have to make the best of that situation. And on that note, I'm led into what has seemingly become my typical question at the end of this sort of a video. Will it happen? Will we see the Arafuras upgunned or otherwise upgraded to take on a more militarily impactful role than simple patrol and presence duties? And for once, I actually think there's a decent chance that the answer today might actually be yes. In the time between when I started and when I finished writing this script, a second Chinese presence, in this case a survey ship, has made itself felt in the waters off Australia's southern coast. Now, this vessel is ostensibly a research ship and poses a far less direct threat to Australia, but the message being sent is unmistakable. The Chinese intend to have a presence in and around Australia on a regular basis, just as their ambassador said they would. Given the clear and growing need for more surface vessels, not in 2027 or 2029, but now, and given the commitment in the Surface Fleet Review by the government to support studies into how these ships could be better utilised, and frankly, given the lack of other options, I think that the government has put up enough signposts that they see the opportunity here and, when they feel like they need to, they will grasp it. It's not going to be perfect. Whatever ultimately ends up becoming of the Arafuras, whether they remain simple patrol boats or take on the mine countermeasure or small boat defense missions, whether they get optimized for surface warfare and shadowing hostile warships or get kitted out for drone warfare, or they're tasked with assisting the Anzacs at ASW, or something else entirely, the Arafura will always be too big, too small, not properly designed, or in some other way ill-suited for the task to which it's been allocated. That's a consequence of decisions made years ago, and now we're stuck with it. But as long as we are stuck with it, I hope and honestly I expect that we'll be able to make the best of a bad situation and get some meaningful value out of these vessels. The Arafura program will never be seen as a triumph of Australian procurement, but that doesn't mean that we have to let it be a failure.